There's still a lot of sorghum left throughout the state. So Josh, walk us through kind of how the sorghum crop looked this year.
Yeah, I mean, the sorghum crop has looked pretty good for the most part this year. The good thing is, and we've talked about it a couple times this summer, there wasn't any big issues this year. The sugarcane aphids were relatively low. We're getting some spikes a little bit later in the year, but overall, compared to previous years, we looked pretty good. I think the biggest challenge growers had this year were weeds. You know, we had a really wet year, wet planting season. What I'm hearing from around the state is it's little bits and pieces here and there. We had some aphids, we had some headworms, some chinch bugs. We had that long stretch in July where we didn't have any rain. It was really warm. So if you escaped some of those, the sorghum looks really good. If you got hit by most, if not all of those, yields are maybe a little bit down.
So let's move on to soybean. A lot of the crop still left unharvested. What are some things you were wanting to stress about when producers are going to be thinking about harvesting that crop?
Yeah, as we're kind of wrapping up our grain summer crops, our corn's mostly out. A lot of the sorghum, especially outside the panhandle, is pretty well out. A lot of growers are now starting to shift to soybean. And with soybean, the biggest thing, very similar to what we found in sorghum, weeds were one of our biggest challenges this year, especially as that dry spell hit in July and then we started getting a lot of rains, we started seeing a lot of late season weeds. So driving through the countryside, you can see a lot of soybean fields with some big mare's tail, pigweeds, maybe some grasses that are a challenge. The bad thing is most of our herbicides are not labeled for this late in the season. Even our double crop soybeans have reached that flowering threshold that is typically our stop point for most of our herbicides. However, as we get towards harvest, growers have the ability to help manage those weeds, not only for an efficient harvest, but for future years in that field, and that's the use of desiccation. My favorite is Paraquat. It really does the job really quickly, really easy, really efficiently. Most growers have really good access to Paraquat, so they can get out there. The biggest thing is that's going to be really good on our broadleafs, our mare's tail, and our pigweed. Not as great on our grasses. We still can have issues, but it really can help clean up some of those fields to make harvest efficient. Then growers, what they need to do is go back in and manage those again, because it typically won't kill those weeds. It'll just make it to where they can get the crop out of the ground. And then any sort of new growth before we get into really cold conditions need to be managed there. The one thing that growers have to be cautious of, we talked about it in sorghum when we talked about reaching black layer before we did anything. Soybean have a very similar thing. It has to reach that physiological maturity. And a lot of growers like to go out and just look at the color. You know, it's turning yellow. That can be misleading. What you actually have to do is just break open the pod. If the seed has separated from the pod, we can typically apply those desiccations without any issue. And what we like to see is almost that spot to where the seed attaches to the pod. It actually gets hardened off and actually turns a brown to black to dark color. And when we get that seed is successfully separated from the plant, and we can go in and start managing that plant for harvest.
Moving to winter crops, the 2018 crop wasn't, the most promising for a lot of winter crops. Kind of walk us through, maybe why that is, and going forward for the 2019 crop, what producers should, be thinking about.
Winter of 17 moving into 18. The problem is we did everything really good. Most of the growers I talked to and walked through their management practices, they did things that needed to be done. We got really a hold of our fall insects. We were really timely on our nitrogen application. We just didn't have the rain, and that really hurt us on the back end there with our lower yields. So whether you be wheat or canola going in, for canola, now's the time. This is usually our really good week for planting canola, and with these good timely rains that we got over the last week, with a little bit of a dry spell, we can see a lot of our growers putting it in this week, over the weekend, and maybe first of next week. And we want to make sure not to stretch to that October 10th deadline. That's an insurable deadline. We can still plant. However, if you're insured, that's your insurance deadline, so you'd have to talk to your agent to see what the guidelines are for that. But we should be able to get a lot in. Once again, good seeding rate, good weed control early, and the same with wheat. Those worms are going to be a big issue. We've seen it with our dual purpose wheat, our growers that have already had wheat planted in. We've seen it with some of our late summer pastures. The Armyworms are really thick this year, and so growers need to be really timely in getting any sort of control measure out on their canola, because really young seedling canola can't take a whole lot of armyworm pressure, especially at seedling to first true leaf. We really have to make sure we're timely, because they'll literally just chop off that canola plant at the soil level, and it just has a tough time coming back from that. So making sure we get a lot of growth up front, you know, setting that good root system, getting everything ready for a winter that may be a little cooler than normal, then that's really the best thing growers can do right now to set us up for a good harvest in 19.
You actually have a conference coming up that's a little bit different from the conferences that you've had in the past. Kind of walk us through what's going on with that.
Yeah, so what we're going to have this year is we're calling it the All Crops Conference, and so what this is it's kind of an interest from Oklahoma State, as well as all of our commodity groups, as well as the NRCS in the state of Oklahoma. And it's not necessarily going to take the place in No-Till Conference, but we're going to try it out. It's going to be around that same time in February 19th and 20th. And what we're doing is we're moving away from looking solely at conservation and looking at conservation and crop management from a whole system perspective. And it doesn't matter if you're a wheat farmer, cotton grower, sorghum, corn, soybean, canola, or if you want to hear about conservation and cover crops and soil health, we're going to have it all there.
Alrighty, thanks Josh.
Thank you.
And for more information on that, go to our website, sunup.okstate.edu.